All right, folks, I'm ready to not get started because you can't see what's on my computer screen. All right, I'm ready to get started now. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the beginning of the second part of the course. We have turned a big corner, having already completed our first exam. So worked through it yesterday, got it done, emailed you last night. You have your scores. This is the curved grade scale. Obviously, it doesn't reflect the same scale on the syllabus, so it's a little bit more generous than that, just given the performance of the class on the first exam. The class average was 61.7. Standard deviation, average distance from the mean for the class was about 20 points. So roughly everybody kind of wound up in the 40 to 80 point range. That's fairly standard for this course. It tends to vary a few points, by class, but overall, it roughly always does land around this. Even though when I started grading, I think it was just by chance, the first 20 were really great, and I was like, oh wow, everybody's doing fantastic, and then it just kind of went the other way. But then it came back, and then it's always an adventure grading. It's kind of like an adventure, just kind of figuring out is all of this worth it? And it is worth it. A lot of you did really well, so congratulations to you that did really well. Some of you wound up in the middle, and that means that your approach is not quite where it needs to be as far as you dedicating yourself to spending more time studying for this class. Like I've said from the beginning, like I've said every time we're together, how well you do in this class is a function of how much time you put into it. Because again, you're being asked to learn a lot of kind of disparate concepts that have their own kind of intricacies to them. And even though there is an umbrella sort of relationship between all of them, each one kind of has its own set of challenges to it that requires you to, pay attention to those enough so that in your mind, you can separate them. Because if not, then it all becomes kind of a blur. And then, when you're given an exam like this, you won't be necessarily as clear about how things work, and things won't go as well as they could go. So ultimately, what was demonstrated to me was what I always know, which is that all of you are fully capable of doing anything and being as good as anyone that's ever been through these walls, but really just throughout the world. Every person starts out not knowing anything, right? And then they go through life and they become the great whatever they wind up becoming, those people that we know about, that we hear about. And everybody is fully capable of that. So if you did not wind up in the couple of top tiers here, don't let that discourage you. It's not a sign that you are incapable of doing these things. It's just a sign that you just don't quite know how to maneuver a class like this yet, or you don't quite know how to have the level of dedication you need to have in order to maneuver your way through a class like this successfully. So you really need to just kind of just take a whole new approach, rethink what you're doing, kind of manage your time better. Time management is optimal. It's pretty much the most important aspect of this whole process. You have taken on other things beyond just college. Some of you are probably working. There's stuff going on in your personal life. You need to always keep that in mind, and you need to have a big picture always about how things are going at the moment relative to the few months ahead and behind you, so that you kind of have a good idea of what's coming up, what you've been able to handle, and what you need to do moving forward as far as a standardized kind of plan for yourself to be able to handle all these big tasks that might be thrown at you that require varying amounts of time and dedication. So planning, time management, super important. But ultimately, like I've said before, and I'll keep saying to you, the most important thing that you can do in this university is to just actualize your potential, realize through your performance what you're capable of, pushing yourself beyond the sort of limits that you think you have as far as what you're able to accomplish, as far as how much time you're willing to dedicate to things, as far as how much knowledge you're able to learn, the level of complexity of the things you're able to learn. Like all these things, you need to challenge yourself now. You need to push yourself further than you even can conceive of, because this is the opportunity that you have. In fact, it's the last opportunity you have to do that before you get out into the world, and you have to show the world what you got. And if you're just kind of skating by here because of like curves that are kind of helping you get by, then that's going to get you by here, but it's not going to get you by out there, because A, there's no curves out there, and B, like, you are going to be competing with everybody out there, people from every walk of life, people from every educational background, people that, have like pushed themselves so hard that they've gotten into like the top tier schools, and they've worked their butt off at those places, competing against, other people that have that same kind of level of motivation and dedication. You're going to be competing against those people. Are those people better than you? No, they are not better than you. There's no way that is the case. They're just better at like figuring out how to make this whole thing work for themselves the best way possible. And a lot of them are cutthroat about it. A lot of them will assert themselves at every possible moment. They will lay their cards on the table. I am this person, and I am here to win. And if you don't bring that same game, which you totally can, you're fully capable of it. You're not going to get the great things that life has to offer. As a college student in the U.S. with a college, once you graduate, you have a college degree. Yeah, there's opportunities for you, and you will have a job. Like, you will not wind up homeless, which is good. You'll have the basic things you need, but like, you're not just here for that. You're not just here just to sustain yourself and just kind of survive. Like, you are here to build something so that you can then move your way up in our social ladder, right? Because there's a very clear social ladder in our world. There's a very clear hierarchical system that, it's very hard to surmount that. And in fact, it's practically impossible to get to the very top. But fortunately, we don't need to get to the very top. We just kind of need to be, towards the top of the middle in this country, and we're good. We have a good life. And that should be enough for most people. But, if you want to push yourself harder, great. Go further. Try to get as high as possible. But in the end, it is about being happy in your life. And if you really work really hard now to like just make the best of yourself from this experience, then you can have options later, which is what ultimately does lead to happiness in life. Like being able to choose what you want to do and how you want to go about kind of succeeding in this world, versus just kind of being, kind of pushed into like one spot where you're just like, all right, I'll take it, like it's fine, but it won't fulfill you. Like, it won't give you what you want out of living, day to day, year after year, decade after decade. Like that kind of path, like, you have to kind of set the road for yourself now, and every moment counts, and every class counts, and every exam counts, and every lecture counts. Everything, all of this counts, because again, this is the last time you're going to have this opportunity to just kind of sit and focus on improving yourself. This is it. Like, beyond that, it's like sink or swim out there. Like, if you go into a situation where there's some kind of opportunity that you like, you want, and let's say you get through the front door of that place and they actually let you in. Like, once you're in there, you can't fake like being that person that everybody wants to have in their organization, the person that is self-sufficient, that is going to bring something extra to the table rather than kind of pull people down and like drain people's time and energy and take from the organization. Ultimately, that will lead to people being eventually excluded from whatever organization that might be. And this applies to even like running your own business. Like, if your plan is to run your own business, great. But if you're not servicing your business properly, if you're not dedicated to it 100% and bringing everything you have to it, and you're dropping the ball, like, customers are going to be dropping off left and right. You're not going to be able to manage your business properly. Your profits are going to be crap. It's the same thing, no matter what approach you take in life, as far as you know, the employment or self-employment route, like in the end, like if you don't build that person now, that is all about like just getting things done and just taking things down and like winning in you know, in whatever way that you define that, then this world will swallow you up, and it will spit you out, and it will forget about you. It is very prone to that. I mean, we see it every day on the news. Like there are people out there, very powerful people that are just very willing to like just not care. And and if you don't make people care about you, they will not care about you. If you don't bring everything you have to the table, you will be excluded because there's 30,000, you know, 30 million other people right there waiting for that same opportunity, and they will take it from you and you will not get it. So this is the time to like become the best person you possibly can be, and all of this can work out for you in the best way possible. And again, it's not about like just like big like philosophical shifts, like, you know, oh, I'm going to completely change my mindset and the way I live my life. No, it's about like, what am I doing in the moment right now? I have the option to not do anything, or I have the option to like do the things that I know I should be doing to, you know, get me on that better path. And once you do that, once you make the decision in each moment to do the right thing for yourself, then that lays the foundation, and that takes you, you know, from this moment to the next, to, you know, the better moments in later in your life. So just try to focus on what you have to do at every moment, and think about like the importance of it, for yourself, not to please a professor, not to please your friends, not to please your parents, but to do it for yourself, because ultimately it has to be for you. If you're not doing it for you, if you don't truly care about yourself and what happens to you in this world, then you're missing out on having like the most important person in this world look out for you, which is yourself. Like, yes, there's other people around, and family and friends, they'll be there, but they won't always be there. They won't be there every single moment during every single difficult time in your life where you are being challenged, because they're being challenged too. You know, like everybody's being challenged. So like you need to be able to just like have it all together. And again, like being able to have that mentality, that drive, that's just sort of instinct ultimately, is what happens here. Like you build that here. And so focus on that, work really hard on it, by just doing your absolute best at the tasks that are set forth for you. And if you do that, everything will work out for you. And again, like I don't think anyone is incapable of being up here. I think everybody is fully capable of being up here. And the only reason that did not happen is because, you know, just you're just not as dedicated to it yet. And I hope you will be. I hope that over time, like that will change and there will be a better result. But I know I'm not talking to all of you. I know some of you are already where you need to be. Everything I've already talked about with respect to like who you can become, a lot of you are already that person. And, you know, good, great, thank you. Thank you for being that person already. Keep being that person, but also keep pushing yourselves, because remember, like, like this place is a very specific place, and the world is not this place, and there's a lot of different types of people out there. So even if you're at the top and you get comfortable being at the top here, like when you get out there, you're not at the top. Like I was always at the top, and I was at the top of SC, and everything I ever took on just top. But when I got into graduate school, like I hadn't had a background in economics, so I just jumped into a master's in economics after taking math courses, etc. And like I wasn't at the top all of a sudden, and everybody around me was really great. And so I really had to step up my game. And then at the PhD level, it was like 10 times worse. Like just the top, you know, like just people that are just like ready to take everything on in the best way possible. Like just they had it, and like you know, I had to go even further. And of course I met the challenge. I finished on time, whereas only, you know, 4 out of 14 of us did. So like I've got that, and like it's going to continue for me. Like this just kind of fell into my lap, this teaching thing, and I love it. It's really enjoyable, but it's definitely not what I ultimately want to do. I want to actually affect things with the economic research I do, but that's going to take me decades, right? So I'm constantly working at that, and and I have no doubt that I will achieve it, because like everything I've done, I've taken on, I've taken the approach that I've described to you, and it's always worked out for me. And I've never let myself down, ever. Like those 5 years I was in the PhD program up north were miserable. Every single day, miserable. I was away from my friends, my family. I was every day being asked to work all day long in order to make sure that I got things done. And I really had no time for like fun. There really weren't many options for fun in that place in Santa Cruz. It's a small town. You have to go like an hour to get anywhere fun. Beyond like the natural stuff, that stuff's fun. But anyway, you know what I mean? LA fun type stuff. And you know, it was miserable. It was a miserable time. And every day, like I woke up and like I was just like, just focus on what you have to do. What do you have to do today? And you know, and then I just did it, you know, and it was like day to night, day to night, day to night, and the days passed, and I could have easily just like, you know, just like fallen into like a miserable state where like I was overwhelmed by like the negative nature of my reality, of my situation, but like I didn't allow it, because I knew that no matter what was going on, that I was going to take care of the things that I needed to be taken care of, and that I would conquer this whole challenge, and I did. And then now it's over, and I'm really happy about that. And that's it. It's like at this point, like nothing can shake me. Like I know that anything that I have set forth for myself to accomplish in my life, I will accomplish, and that is the end of the story. And it's that kind of like confidence, it's that kind of like certainty, that creates you know, like a stable kind of pleasant state of mind, which you need in life, because we know that there's just all sorts of things in this world that can easily bring you down. And then B, it is that thing that it is those aspects that kind of that do establish that like drive that you need to like just head towards your goal and like ultimately achieve those goals. So don't let this opportunity pass you by, folks. Like don't blow it. Like it's here. It's right in front of you. Like just get it done. Like it's so right in front of you. It's like just right there. And for some of you it's just not happening yet, or for whatever reason, you know, you're just not allowing it to happen, and you should, and change for the better, for yourselves. It's all for you. It's all for you. So make sure that you turn this around. And again, this is ultimately just a class, and it is just a grade. So you know, whatever happens in the course, if it doesn't turn out well for you, um, don't let it be a sign of like, you know, it just some kind of reflection of your ability, or like, you know, that is not the case. Like you just haven't dedicated enough time to it. Upper division courses are harder than lower division courses. Economics courses are harder than most courses, unless you get into like the physical sciences and stuff. Like, you know, this is like right there. It's like right before that. Like, so, you know, it's like you have to take it seriously, and you have to give it what it requires. And I hope you will. You know, but there's time. We have a couple more exams. We have a paper. You know, you could turn things around. If you did not wind up in these couple two tiers, if you're kind of over here, you can move your way up, of course. But there's also the consideration that now that there has been a curve, that essentially there is going to be a curve in the class. And so now, like, it's about like trying to muscle your way to the top, versus, you know, the people that are already there, that have already like kind of staked their claim. So you know, just work really hard, and then, you know, things will improve. But again, some of you have done well. Some of you are already where you need to be. So thank you for being in my class. It's always a pleasure to have you in my class. And B, keep it up. You know, keep up the good work. So again, these are the scores that translated from your actual score. I'll pass out the exams at the end of today, and there'll be a score out of 100 there. And so what I did was I targeted an average for the class, which is a 70, and then that gave me a number that the exam was out of to get that 70 score. And so your score is out of that number. I think it was 80. It was like 80 or 81 points or something, which is what I needed to get everybody to that like C average, to get the whole class to the C average. So and so then it was your score out of 100 that you got on the exam, but as far as my grading it was your score out of 80 something, and then that gave me a percentage, and I multiplied that by 20, which is how much your exam is worth as far as its impact on your overall grade in the class, 20%. So that's where the Moodle score comes from. So out of like 80 or 81 or 82, I forget what it was, you got some percentage, multiply that by 20, and that's where the Moodle score came from. Only the number out of 20 matters. The other stuff on Moodle doesn't matter. It's just the system making calculations that are silly, have nothing to do with me, and I can't get rid of them, so they are there. Ignore them. Just worry about the points that you got on the Moodle score as a reflection of the score you got on your actual exam. And then, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. If there's something you feel I did wrong on the exam, like I mentioned in the email, make sure that you check the answer keys online that I've posted against your exam. And if you find an error, let me know, and I'll write it up. You got to write it up, submit it to me, and I'll address it, of course. But, I was very careful, so I don't generally have any kind of errors. But, I'm not perfect, and I never would claim to be so. So I may have made an error. Make sure you check your exams and just make sure. But beyond that, do you have any questions about the exam? All right, cool. Then we can actually move forward with the course. All right, so we are starting now on the second part of the course, which will basically kind of take us through to the end of the course. So in the last part of the course, we established basic intuitions about like managerial economics. We went through the market model, supply, demand, equilibrium that results from that. That represents a perfectly competitive market, where the market is as competitive as it can possibly be, is as efficient as it can possibly be, meaning that producer and consumer surplus are at their maximum. The market is doing the best possible. But that's not always the case in the real world. There is what we call market failure, where the market is not doing that. It's not equilibrating at the most efficient equilibrium. And one of the main reasons for that is what we call market power, the ability of firms to price above their costs because of certain barriers to entry that don't allow a lot of competition in those industries. And so we have to consider the varying sort of spectrum of how competitive a market can be when we're analyzing the supply decision, which is what we're going to be looking at mainly moving forward. So we need to consider all those cases. So we will consider all those cases. In order to consider those cases, which is ultimately considering questions of like, how much should firms be producing in different competitive contexts? What prices should they be charging? How much profit will they make as a result of that? And how will these varying circumstances affect those profits? In order to address all those questions, we need to do what we normally do in economics, the approach we took in chapter 1, which is to compare costs and benefits. If we're addressing questions of whether to do something or not, then we look at overall costs and benefits, which is what we did with like the present value analysis for certain projects, like you do a present value of the income stream versus the cost, and you figure out, is it worth it or not to do a project. When you're trying to figure out how much of something to produce, you have to use marginal analysis. You have to analyze what is the extra benefit of doing one more unit of this, producing one more unit, versus what is the extra cost of doing one more unit of this. And so in order to do that, we need to understand the nature of costs of firms in general, just like in the most general cases, like what are the costs that firms have? Well, in order to understand that, we need to understand like what is production. So like in order to so obviously everything is based on models, right? They're based on economic models. Economic models have simplifying assumptions that allow us to kind of look at the most general cases and like analyze things in the most general way, which provides us like a benchmark understanding that ultimately gives us intuition about how things work relative to how they're actually working in practice. So in practice, things are going to be different than what we analyze here because of the complexities of the world. But if you have that basic intuition, then you know, well, in the standard case, this is how things work, and what's different in this situation is A, B, and C. So these are the things I need to be focused on relative to what could be happening in order to get it to happen the way I think it should happen, etc. So the starting point of building the model that then gives us all these intuitions is to model the production process. So that's what we do here. We're going to start this chapter by just laying out the basic ideas that underlie how we model production via what's called a production function, which is just a relationship between inputs and outputs. And so we'll talk about the various sort of intricacies of that. We'll talk about the fact that production is different in the long run versus the short run. The short run being defined as a time period in which at least one input into production is fixed, and that changes the nature of what a firm can do versus in the long run when all variables, when all inputs into production are variable, and the firm can adjust everything in order to optimize their production and minimize their costs, which will ultimately maximize their revenues, which is ultimately what all of this is about. Learning the insights that managers can gain from this theory to maximize profits for firms, which is how firms are valued, so really maximizing the value of firms. So that's what we'll focus on today. Chapter 5 will go all the way through next week. So we'll start today, and depending on how far I get today, I think at the beginning of next time, I'll do a quick review of derivatives because we're going to start taking derivatives in order to analyze measures of productivity, which ultimately will get us to that intuition we need about like the marginal benefit versus marginal cost of doing, the things that firms do, that managers ultimately do as well. And then that'll take us to our understanding of cost. And once we're done with this chapter, then you should have like just the general framework that we use to analyze all the different market contexts. And then the next chapter goes into just kind of intuitions about like how to, in practice, kind of do the things that you need to do in order to actually find the inputs you need into production in the most efficient way, cost-effective way possible. And then in the 7th chapter, that's where we talk about like the nature of industry, what makes one industry more competitive than another, and it's all dependent on costs. So the nature of costs is super important because that is the direct link to like what gives us the intuition about how one industry is structured versus another, be it very competitive, be it not very competitive with just a few large firms dominating. And then once we establish sort of the general nature of that, then we will start talking about the 4 cases that we consider of different type of markets based on their competitiveness, perfectly competitive at one end, monopoly on the other end with only one firm dominating the market, and then the in-between cases, which are the oligopoly and monopolistic competition. And then we'll talk about some ancillary subjects towards the end of the course. The oligopoly stuff we'll cover at the last part of the course as well, because that's the most complicated and requires a couple of chapters with different models to address some of the issues in the more complicated market setting. But it's all going to be more connected. But still, like if you if you're not kind of like following this stuff from the beginning, like if you're not understanding the nature of production, which leads to like your understanding about costs, which then allows you to understand like how industries are organized, which then allows you to understand how how you operate in one business, one market setting versus another, you're going to lose an important fragment of information at some point, which is going to stop you from understanding it all in the way you need to understand it. So I implore you to please like just try to stay plugged into the course. Like, don't drop the ball. Don't feel like, oh, first exam's done, I'm going to kind of relax and like not think about this stuff for a while. Like, that is a recipe for disaster. So don't let it happen. Stay plugged in. If you didn't do that well, just, shrug it off. Don't worry about it. Move forward. Focus on what you can do today. Focus on what you can do tomorrow. Make sure you build your understanding of this stuff as we go through it, and things will work out. But again, it's all up to you. It's all dependent on what you will be willing to give to this course and this whole process that you've willingly undertaken versus the old days where you were forced to be somewhere and there was gates and there were people like patrolling the halls making sure you were in class or whatever. Like, that's not this, and it's not this. This is you being an adult deciding, I want to improve myself. I want to make things work out better for myself. So make it work out better for yourself. Choose the right things. All right, are there any questions before I get into the actual lecture? All right, just a reminder, Chapter 4's mini paper is due Sunday night, so you still have an opportunity to work on that. And Chapter 5 will be fairly abstract. Chapter 6 and 7, though, will have a little bit more sort of practical information, which is sort of good content for writing mini papers. So, it might be a good idea to kind of get on top of those things and knock them out. The sooner you get the papers done, the better for you. People that write the paper early on in the semester are really happy at the end because they don't have to write the paper at the end. They just kind of have to throw it together. It takes like an hour to kind of polish it up or whatever and get it into one, final version. So take advantage of that. It'll help you. Things will work out better towards the end when, the shit hits the fan, as it were, when there's like 5 papers and 4 finals and, whatever else you have to do. Like, you can avoid that. So avoid it at all costs. All right, let's move forward with production and costs. But again, we're just going to focus on the production function today. So in this chapter, we'll see how a manager can exploit an existing technology to its greatest potential. So we're just going to assume that the technology is not improving, that there's no R&D being done. Like, it's not complicated. It's like the firm has an existing state of technology that it uses to produce. So we'll consider a production process that utilizes 2 inputs into production. You're either going to have labor, the workers, pretty standard. And then everything else that you use to produce, we'll just kind of throw into the capital category. So capital and labor will be the 2 inputs into production. Capital generally we'll think about as like man-made, people-made things that are used to produce. So buildings, machinery, tools, those sorts of things. So again, we're simplifying the world in order to gain important intuitions about the nature of production, which then gives us important intuitions about the nature of cost. So again, only 2 inputs being considered, capital and labor. We'll let K denote the quantity of capital, so that'll be the standard sort of notation for capital. We'll use K. And we'll let L denote the quantity of labor. And then Q, of course, will be the level of output produced in the production process. And the general ideas presented here are valid for any 2 inputs and also will translate to the more complicated cases where you have more than 2 inputs into production. And maybe like different types of labor, who knows? Like the more complicated cases, everything that all the intuition we build here will translate to those situations. So in general, the production function is an engineering relation that defines a maximum amount of output that can be produced with a given set of inputs. And mathematically, the production function is denoted as this. Just Q is a function of capital and labor. So much like when we first established the demand function, and we just established it as a relationship between quantity demanded and the price of the good, the price of related goods, income, etc. And we just kind of had like a general relationship. This is the same thing. It's a general mathematical relationship telling us that quantity is dependent on the amount of capital and labor. We don't know how it's dependent on it. That relationship can take different forms depending on the nature of the production that we're looking at. We'll give a couple of examples of like the extreme cases of what production can look like, and then we'll get to the most common case, and that's the one we'll use throughout the course. All right. So before we get into the specifics of the nature of the that engineering relation, the production function, let's talk about the distinction between the short run versus the long run. So as a manager, your job is to use the available production function efficiently by determining how much of each input to use to produce output. So that's important because depending on the mix that you use of capital and labor, it will affect your cost. So you need to be very mindful of that. Like, what is the right combination of inputs? What are my limitations to getting the right combination of inputs? Well, in the short run, there's going to be at least one fixed factor of production. So let's say you have leased a building which your factory is going to be housed in, and that lease is for 3 years. And you're just setting up shop, and regardless of what the demands are of the markets for you, maybe things are going really well and you want to really expand the scale of your production, you're tied in for 3 years to that lease. And so because of that, you are in the short run. You cannot vary the amount of your factory space, let's say. And then when you get into the long run, you can do that. You'll be able to expand your factory space to expand your production process and maybe get more assembly lines going, etc. But again, because of the fact that you are locked into maybe a building or maybe locked into like a certain amount of capital machinery that you used to produce, that is limiting how much of that one input you can change to affect the amount of output that you produce. And so because of that, you are in, just by definition, by assumption, the short run. So we're going to assume capital and labor are the only two inputs in production and that the level of capital is fixed in the short run. I think there's one homework problem where it switches it and assumes labor is the one fixed, just for the sake of the problem. But overall, as far as everything we do beyond like some homework problem, like we assume capital is the input into production that is fixed. So in the short run, because your capital is fixed, then your output, your quantity of output is only a function of the variable input, which is labor. Labor is the only input into production that you can vary. So if you want to produce more, you have to hire more people. That's essentially what that's saying. So in the short run production function, in the simple case that we consider where production is only a function of capital and labor, is only a function of labor because capital is fixed. So if K star is a fixed level of capital, the short run production function may be written as quantity as a function of some fixed amount of capital and L being the only variable that is affecting our quantity of output. Of course, like I mentioned, the long run is defined as the horizon over which the manager can adjust all factors of production. But how it works is like just theoretically, if you get into the short run because you can adjust like your factory space or you can get more assembly lines, as soon as you do that, you are in a new short run. Once you lock yourself into a new level of capital, you are once again in a new short run situation in which you are limited to what that amount of capital allows you to do given the amount of labor that you can vary in your production process. So every time you kind of lock yourself into a fixed amount of capital for whatever the circumstance might be, you are in a short run situation. When you're in the long run, you can adjust those, but as soon as you do, you're back into a short run situation. Yeah.
So in the short run, capital is fixed. So in the short run, labor would be like more variable.
Yeah, it's the only variable. It's the only way that you can affect the amount of output you produce by hiring or more people or firing people. All right, so let's talk about measures of productivity. So, an important component of managerial decision making is the determination of the productivity of inputs used in the production process. So, there's a few measures of productivity we look at here. Yeah. Well, I mean that's stuff that like again like this is like the most general benchmark case, and it's meant to just provide you like basic intuitions about how things can go on average during the most normal situations. When you have extreme kind of events that throw you off, like that's going to throw off like obviously the basic functions of what we're talking about, and that's where your kind of just ability to deal with reality comes into play, and like you have to improvise and like whatever. But like we don't take that into consideration here because if we did, then we'd have to complicate the model quite a bit, and it would totally muddy the intuition that you would gain from it. So yeah, I mean, we can consider more complicated cases, but we don't. So don't let your mind go to the more complicated cases. You gotta live within the models. You gotta live within the simplicity of the models to understand them and to gain the basic intuition from them, and then deal with the world as it comes once you're in it. All right, so measures of productivity. The first one obviously is just how much output is being produced. So total product is the maximum level of output that can be produced with a given amount of inputs. Of course, another important measure of productivity, which will provide important insights as far as like average costs go, which play a big role in sort of in determining important decisions for a firm with respect to like how much they're producing and how much they are either making in profit or lack thereof. Which is this measure of productivity is both intuitive as far as like what it tells you about production, but what it also will tell us about cost once we get to the cost part, which we'll get to next week. It's all connected, but definitely the average product is an important measure of productivity we will be considering, of course, and it is just defined as the total product divided by the quantity used of a particular input. So on average, how much is each laborer producing, right? You're producing at a certain level. You've got a certain amount of folks. On average, how much is each one producing? It's the average product of labor. It's the amount of, again, the total product divided by the amount of labor is the average product of labor. And you can have, of course, an average product of capital. How much on average is each unit of my output helping me to produce? Well, that's my average product of capital. So you've got a total product, Q divided by K, the amount of capital, average product of capital. All right, the most important measure of productivity, though, is the marginal product. The marginal product of an input is the change in total output attributable to the last unit of an input. At the current production level, if I were to hire one more person, how much extra output can I gain from hiring that extra person? Well, that's the marginal product. I know on average how much folks are producing, but like how much will that next person produce? That's my marginal product of labor. So the marginal product of capital is the change in total output divided by the change in capital. And just mathematically, you can see that you've got that change sign there, that triangle, change in Q, the dependent variable, over the change in one of the independent variables, which is K. So therefore, this is also the derivative of the production function with respect to capital. So taking the slope of the production function at any point tells us at that point, hiring one more person or employing one more unit of capital, how much extra output will we gain from that extra unit that we hire? So the marginal product of capital, similar, is the change in total output divided by the change in labor. And again, it will be the derivative of the production function with respect to labor. And again, it tells us if you hire one extra worker, how much extra output can you gain? Marginal products. All right, so here we have just a sample production function tabularly presented. it's what we again call a discrete case, where we just consider numbers that are whole. We don't consider fractional numbers. And the best way to represent that is via a table. Of course, then we go on to the continuous case that can be represented graphically. So we'll jump into that after this example. And then beyond that, once you understand the relationship between these variables and the nature of this relationship that we are studying overall via the graph, then we'll jump into the math, the equations that represent the relationships. So starting here, we see we have a fixed level of capital. So what does that mean as far as like the time frame we're in? We're in the short run. Excellent. So we are in the short run, and therefore our first column tells us that we have 2 units of capital regardless of how much output we have, regardless of how much labor we have. Our capital is fixed. Here's our labor, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, just each row representing the change in our production with respect to hiring an additional person. This column here tells us the change in labor as we go from one row to the next. Again, we're only adding 1 person per row. So that's our change in labor. So remember, the marginal product of labor is the change in our output with respect to the change in labor. So the bottom of that expression will always be 1 as far as this example goes. And generally, we will always consider the extra output produced by employing 1 additional person. So that the change in labor will always be 1. And then we see that obviously when we have two units of capital and 0 units of labor, that's going to get a 0 output. But when we hire that first person, then that first person is going to get a 76 units of output. So the marginal product of labor is 76 units for that first person. And the average product of labor is going to be the total output. In this case, it's going to equal 76 divided by 1. So average product and marginal product are equivalent, obviously, with that first person. Second person, we see that our total output has gone up to 248 units by having 2 people working. And that means that the extra output produced by employing that second person, the marginal product of labor of that second person hired, is 172 units. And the average product of labor works like any average. Like you add a number to it, and if the number is bigger, it brings the average up. If the number is smaller, it brings the average down, just like grade point averages, right? You add a high grade, it brings your average up. Bring a low grade, brings your average down. So the marginal product of labor will affect the average product of labor. And if it's greater than the average product of labor, so like here's our marginal product of labor of the second person, 172. Here's our average product of labor when we only had 1 person. You're adding a bigger number to that, dividing it by 2, and it will bring the overall average up. So if the marginal product of labor is greater than the average product of labor, then the average product of labor will be increasing. We see that continue on. Here's that third person. Overall output is at 492 now. That means that third person added extra output in the quantity of 244 units. So the marginal product of labor of the third person hired is 244 units. 244 units greater than our previous average product of labor brought our overall average product of labor up to 164. Another thing to notice here is that the marginal product of labor is increasing as we hire these first few people. So essentially, we make a very sort of general and important assumption here about the production process. So we assume, like any production process, if you have 1 person working, then that person is going to be doing everything, right? They're going to be producing, they're going to be maintaining the machines, they're going to be answering the phones, they're going to be keeping the books, etc. You hire another person, and then you get division of labor, right? You get specialization. They start to divide up the tasks. That means that their efficiency improves. That means that they can start producing more. And that's why our marginal product of labor increases initially from that first person, that second person, to that third person, to that fourth person, fifth person, sixth person. We see 5 and 6, it kind of levels out there. Yeah. We're not computing it, we're just taking it as it's given from the table. We're computing it based on what is being given to us. But as far as like the actual numbers that you're seeing, it's the difference between like, so here's one person in total is able to produce 76 units. Two people in total are able to produce 248 units. So the change in our quantity is 172 over the change in labor, which is 1. You got it? Cool. And that relationship holds throughout the column, of course, going from the third to the fourth. 3 people in total produce 492. 4 people in total produce 784. That means the extra output, the marginal product of labor of the fourth person, is 292. The change in output with respect to the change in labor, 292 over 1 for that fourth person. All right, so we see the marginal product of labor increases, and then kind of levels out. Again, what this is telling us is that initially we are benefiting in this very general production process, which will be the nature of the production process we track throughout the entire course. We see that that it benefits from specialization, division of labor, but eventually that benefit like dries up. The marginal product of labor becomes stinted here and then starts to diminish as we go beyond the 7th person here, right? So the 7th person's marginal product of labor is less than the marginal product of labor of the 6th person, and the 8th person's marginal product of labor is less than the 7th, and so on and so forth, all the way to the point where it actually becomes negative in this example. So the reason for that is because this firm is in the short run. So just imagine a general production process. Yeah, you only have one person. They're doing everything. You hire 2 people. They start to divide stuff up. Things get more efficient. You hire 4th, 5th. Great. Dividing labor, things become more efficient. Eventually, though, you want to produce more because things are going well in the market. You want to produce more output. You want to sell more. But there's only so much room in your factory. There's only so much the existing employees can do with the assembly lines that are available, right? So even though you hire more people, that the efficiency starts to decrease. Now, does that mean that that's a bad or a good thing? Well, that's a question we'll answer in a bit when we compare benefits to costs. But one thing we do know is that even though our marginal product starts to decrease beyond the 6th person, it's still positive. So we still have a positive amount of output being produced, like by the 7th person, and so that's a good thing. You know, they're like you're adding another person, and they are producing more, and that's what you want. But you obviously do need to keep in mind that like your marginal product of labor, the extra amount of output being produced, is actually starting to decrease at that point. But you can see that even though it's starting to decrease, it's still bringing up the average product of labor because the marginal product of labor is still greater than the average product of labor, even when it starts to diminish. So here, the 7th person, the marginal product of labor, the extra amount of output produced by employing that 7th person was 292. Adding it to the average of 236 and dividing it by 2 in this case will get us to 244. And so what happens there is, even though the marginal product of labor starts to diminish, our average product will continue to increase until the point where they are equivalent. And then beyond that point, the marginal product of labor will diminish to the point where it is below the average product of labor. So it will start to bring down the average amount of output per laborer at that point. So the relationship between marginal product and average product is important to understanding the nature of production, and also ultimately how that's going to affect your costs, which will affect your costs in very clear ways, and will ultimately affect your production decisions in very clear ways. So that relationship is very important. All right, now let's look at the continuous case. So here we're going to have our labor output, the amount of labor on the x-axis, and we're holding capital constant. We're assuming we are in the short run. And on the y-axis, depending on which curve we're looking at, if we're looking at the total product curve, that again tells us the total amount of output that we can produce at a certain level of our variable input, which is labor. Then when we're looking at this curve, that's total product will be the y-axis. If we're looking at the marginal product of labor, the extra amount of output produced by employing additional units of labor, then obviously on the y-axis we're going to have marginal product. And then if we're looking at average product, then again, that's going to be what the y-axis represents. We have three different graphs on here, so just keep that in mind. All right, so the figure shows graphically the relationship among our three important measures of productivity: total product, average product, and marginal product. The first thing to notice is that total product increases and its slope gets steeper as we move from A to C. So as we move from A to C, that's the range over which you're hiring extra people and you are benefiting from specialization, from division of labor, and the marginal product of labor is increasing. Each additional person is producing more than the last person hired, which graphically is represented by a slope that is positive. So the total product curve has a positive slope. So the slope gets steeper, becomes greater as we move from point A to point E. Remember, the marginal product of labor is the extra amount of output produced by employing an additional unit of labor, and it is also the derivative, the slope at a point of our total product curve. So if you take the derivative of any of the points here, to see how much is total product changing with respect to just the change in 1 unit of input, then you're getting the marginal product of labor. So that it can be plotted as the marginal product of labor curve. So the marginal product of labor curve is plotting the change in the slope as we're moving from left to right on the total product curve. And again, it's reflecting everything that we talked about in the table a moment ago. Over that level of division of labor and specialization with respect to the amount of input used, your marginal product of labor is increasing, and therefore each additional unit hired will produce more than the last unit hired up until point E, and therefore marginal product of labor will increase up until that point. And of course, the average product of labor, again, it's going to be, if the marginal product of labor is greater than the average product of labor, it's bringing the average product of labor up. Until here they're equivalent, and then marginal product of labor starts to decrease, which starts to bring down the average product of labor. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the point at which the switch happens and our average product starts to decrease, which will be more significant when you understand how that relates to costs and then the decisions that are based on the cost. So that significance of that point will be more important later than it is right now. But as far as just like the relationships that we see here, just graphically, like it's that point is the point at which average product is at its maximum. All right, so marginal product increases as we move from point A to point E. The range over which marginal product increases is known as the range of increasing marginal returns. So again, it is due to the division of labor and specialization. So the figure also demonstrates that marginal product reaches its maximum at point E, where 5 units of labor are employed. As the usage of labor increases from the 5th through the 10th unit, total output increases, but at a decreasing rate. So from the 5th person hired to the 10th person hired, the marginal product of labor is still positive. So there is additional output being produced by employing additional folks, which is what is bringing up our total product curve. But obviously that starts to diminish because of the fact we're in the short run, and the laborers are limited by the amount of capital they're using. The more and more people being hired, the more they start to get in each other's way, the less they have the ability to produce efficiently. And so the slope of our total product curve starts to become flatter and flatter and flatter, which again means that our marginal product of labor starts to decrease, which means again that the extra amount of output produced by employing an additional person will be less than the prior person for each additional person hired. And then eventually, so this is why marginal product declines between 5 and 10 units. And over that range, how we describe it, it is the range of decreasing or diminishing marginal returns, as I've already said, to our variable input. So we are experiencing diminishing marginal returns to labor over that range there. And then eventually it can get so bad that people that you hire actually start to hurt your production process and decrease the total product that can be produced. And that's what we see happening past the 10th person. So past the 10th person, marginal product of labor becomes negative, which actually starts to decrease the total product, which corresponds to that final line on the table that we looked at where the marginal product of labor was negative. So notice that the marginal product becomes negative when more than 10 units of labor are employed. The range over which marginal product is negative is known as negative marginal returns. So you definitely want to avoid that range. Are there any questions about this stuff? Yeah.
When we have to stop hiring a person? When's the next step?
So that's the next thing we're going to address. So to hire a person, like you have to consider what's the extra cost and benefit of hiring a person. So this will give us an idea about the benefit, and then we have to compare it to the cost, which is their wage, which we'll do in a bit, I think, if we have time to. All right, so what all this is the phases of marginal returns, just getting us to the basic principle. As the usage of an input increases, marginal product initially increases, where you have increasing marginal returns. Then it begins to decline when you have decreasing marginal returns, and eventually becomes negative where you have negative marginal returns. So regardless of what kind of production process you are engaged in, you will always run up into this kind of pattern due to the fact that you have limited your capital in some way. Like in some way you will limit some input into production over some period of time. Therefore, you will be in a short run situation, and therefore the nature of your production process will have this pattern. All right, so the role of the manager in the production process, very important. A manager needs to make sure that employees are producing on the production function. So you could have an idea of like the nature of your production and like what the limitation of your fixed capital does to that. But if you're not getting your workers to actually work on your production function, then all the intuition goes out the window, because if they're not actually working on that curve, producing the way that you expect them to produce, given what the nature of your production would imply, then you can't depend on these ideas for intuition. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, if things were to go well for someone like that, then I would think at some point they would realize they need a bigger building, so they would sell it, and they would get a new one. And then, so when they sell it and get a new one, that's the long run, right? But when they get that new one and it's bigger and they're locked into another lease, that's once again a new short run situation. But that would shift our production function, like it would like shift it up. So at every amount of labor, you could produce more. All right, so again, the role of the production manager, the most important one is to produce on the production function. So the first managerial role is one of the most difficult for a manager to perform. The production function describes the maximum possible output that can be produced with given inputs. For the case of labor, then this means that workers must be putting forth maximal effort. To ensure that workers are working at full potential, the manager must institute an incentive structure that induces them to put forth the desired level of effort. So we'll lightly touch upon these issues in the next chapter, but this class is not necessarily about that. So for those of you that are management majors, I'm sure you're taking other courses that provide you more insights into how to manage folks and actually get them to work at the level you need them to work. The main concept that we'll lightly touch upon in this class is like it's important to kind of align the interests of the workers with the interests of the firm. Like everybody has to be working for the same goal, and so like incentive structures that are based on profits of the firm can help everybody to kind of be working towards the same goal. And so that's basically the basic principle that underlies all approaches. And I manage people like. When I was 16 all the way through the end of college, I worked at a phone center. I became a manager. I managed like 200 people towards the end of that. And people generally tended to really like me and work really hard for me. And the reason for that is because I treated them like people. Like if you treat people with respect and you treat them like people, then they will at least be inclined to want to put in effort. And beyond that, obviously, incentive structures are necessary. Their basic wage is just what is expected for them to be given that they are employed. So that's not an incentive. It's a question of like, what is the kind of firm you're working in, managing? Like, what are the incentives that you can create given the nature of the place you're working? It's about being creative and thoughtful. But like the basic notion is, of course, I try to align the interests of workers with the firm. All right, so the other important task of the manager is to use the right level of inputs. How do you know how many folks to hire, as was asked? So the second role of the manager is to ensure that the firm operates at the right point on the production function. So the way to do that is to look at the extra benefit of hiring a person versus the extra cost of hiring a person. So the extra benefit of hiring a person is going to be the amount of output, but really it is the value of that output. How much can that output be sold at in the market that you need to consider? And that is what we call the value of marginal product. So the value of marginal product of an input is the value of the output produced by the last unit of that input. It's the marginal product, let's say, of labor, the extra output produced by employing an additional person, times the amount that it can be sold at, the market price of the good that you're operating, of the market that you're operating in. So generally, if each unit of output can be sold at some price P, the value of marginal product of labor is equal to, so we denoted VMP subscript L to say that, again, we're talking about the value of marginal product of labor. That's going to equal the price times the marginal product of labor. So that's the benefit of hiring a person, the value of the extra amount of output they can produce in revenue terms. And the value of the marginal product of capital is, of course, similar concept, but we're just going to look at the marginal product of capital times the price. So should I buy that extra huge assembly plant? Well, let me look at the extra amount of output I can get from it times the amount that I can sell it at versus what it'll cost me to get that kind of operation. All right, so here we've got our production function again. We've got our labor. We've got the price of output. We're going to assume is $3 and it's constant here. And the marginal product of labor is what it was before, again, increasing because of increasing returns up until the point where the short run creates that barrier to efficiency, which then gets the firm to that diminishing marginal returns range, ultimately getting us to that negative returns range. Here's the value of the marginal product of labor, the value of the extra amount of output from additional persons hired. So you hire that first person, marginal product of labor, they produce 76 extra units, multiply that by the amount those units can be sold at, $3, gets us to the value of the marginal product of labor. We're going to assume here the wage is $400, it's fixed per laborer. So we see that the extra benefit of hiring that first person definitely outweighs the cost of hiring that first person, $400. I'm sorry, it does not outweigh the cost. Sorry. It does not outweigh the cost, but we are at the start of the production process, right, where like division of labor will increase marginal product of labor, which means that the value of the marginal product of labor will also increase initially. And so even though hiring that first person doesn't necessarily make sense, you understand that hiring the next person will get you additional marginal product because of increasing returns. So the second person produces 172 units times the price sold, which is $516. So $516 is greater than $400, so it did make sense to hire that person. Third person, because of increasing returns, marginal product of labor increase, which means the value of the marginal product of labor increase, which got us to $732 worth of output from hiring the third person, which is greater than what it costs to hire that person, which is $400. So definitely hire that third person. And because of increasing returns, the value of the marginal product of labor will, of course, increase and then start to decrease because of diminishing returns. So over the range of diminishing returns is where it becomes relevant, like this comparison of like the extra benefit of hiring a person versus the extra cost. And we see that the benefit outweighs the cost up until, in this case, the 10th person. So the 9th person has a value of marginal product of labor, which is $516, greater than $400, which is the wage. So definitely marginal benefit outweighs the marginal cost. But the marginal benefit of hiring the 10th person is only $228, which is less than the marginal cost. So therefore, it doesn't make sense to hire that person. And therefore, the optimal amount of folks to hire, the profit maximizing level of folks to hire that, again, will minimize your costs and maximize your revenue is going to be 9 people at this particular production plant that we're considering. So that gets us to this principle, the profit maximizing input usage. To maximize profits, a manager should use inputs at levels at which the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. When we're looking at the table and we're looking at discrete values, you can't get it to that point. So higher up until the point where marginal benefit outweighs marginal cost, and once it becomes the other way around, stop, as we did. So specifically, when the cost of each additional unit of labor is W, the manager should continue to employ labor up to the point where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage in the range of diminishing marginal products. We saw that those were equal at the beginning when we had increasing marginal products. So that obviously was a point that you don't need to think about. And so what this relationship ultimately does is establish the demand for labor by the firm. So our marginal product of labor, we know, has that like hump-shaped curve, again, because you have that increasing returns and the decreasing returns. If you multiply that whole thing by the price the stuff can be sold at, you get the value of the marginal product of labor, which will have that same hump-shaped curve. And so over the range where the value of the marginal product of labor is decreasing is the range over which a firm will consider how many folks to hire. And again, they're going to hire up until the point where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage. So beyond that point, they're not going to want to hire because the extra benefit of hiring additional folks is less than the cost of hiring a person. So when the wage rate is W naught, the profit maximizing quantity of labor is such that the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage in the range of diminishing marginal returns. And again, that does establish the demand for labor. So when you think about like labor markets and there's a demand for labor versus a supply of labor, the downward sloping demand of labor is essentially the value of the marginal product of labor over the diminishing returns range of production for a firm. And again, the optimal point of hiring is the point where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage. All right, folks, we are done with this. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to pass out exams. I forgot about that. So let me stop the recording and I will pass out your exams.